If I asked you right now who the strongest character in the Naruto universe is, the majority of you, at least those of you who are caught up with Boruto, would say it's Jiraiya, and you'd be correct. However, before that title belonged to Jiraiya, who did it belong to? Was it Naruto? Was it Daemon? Was it Code? What about when Jigen and Isshiki were still alive and kicking? What about Momoshiki, Toneri, Madara, Obito? All these people who at different points in times have held on to the moniker of strongest in the Naruto universe. And as I got thinking about this idea and walking myself backwards in time, I realized that the crown of strongest in the universe has rested atop the head of dozens of people. And that's really interesting. And as I've been looking at Naruto recently through the lens of a grand timeline, I figured one of the best ways to map out this grand timeline is to walk through it from the earliest known entries to modern day and really try to make a comprehensive list of the entire timeline of Naruto in correlation with who was the strongest in the universe at those individual times. And while building that timeline, I really want to try and hammer out exactly when that baton was passed. If Minato ever was the strongest person on Earth, when did he take that baton from somebody like Hiruzen? And so on and so forth, because building out a timeline like this actually allows us to map out really well the geopolitical situation of the Naruto world, as a lot of the strongest in the universe batons being passed from one person to another happened because the previous strongest person, well, kicks the bucket. All that is to say is that we got an ambitious one today, because today we're talking the history of the strongest people in Naruto explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for an additional NC Hammer 23 video every single week, guys, you can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. Gaara and Sasuke's fight has wrapped up, and it's time for the Konoha Crush arc. So, if we're gonna build an entire timeline of Naruto's universe based off who was the strongest at certain moments in time, we have to start this video off in the way that we tend to start these kinds of videos off, at the beginning. Which means the first entry we're gonna be talking about today is rather obviously Kaguya. Now listen, I could speculate about who was maybe the strongest in the era of humanity that existed before Kaguya descended down to Earth, but there is no way to say anything for certain. Maybe Tenza, the chieftain of the tribe who ends up marrying Kaguya, was the strongest human in humanity at that moment in time, but like I said, there's no reason to speculate. And therefore, Kaguya is rather obviously our first pick. Now listen, I know some of you Boruto readers are saying, oh wait, Nick, but there was probably a brief moment there where Isshiki was the strongest person on Earth, and you're not wrong. From what we learned in Boruto, Kaguya and Isshiki descended down to Earth together, and Kaguya, as the lower-ranking Otsutsuki of the two, was supposed to be the one fed to the Ten Tails to create a divine tree and a chakra fruit for Isshiki to consume. However, seemingly sick of the system that forced her to repeatedly be consumed and rebirthed through the medium of a karma marking, Kaguya decided on Earth that she was done with being the lower-ranked Otsutsuki, and thus she launched a surprise attack against Isshiki where she tore him in half and presumably fed his legs to the Ten Tails that she was going to be fed to, which created the first chakra fruit that she consumed after Tenza, her husband, and all of humanity turned against her after they realized how powerful she was when she was kidnapped by a rival clan. A rival clan that she wiped out on account of the fact that she was an Otsutsuki who was much more powerful than them. Now, because of the contradictory nature of Kaguya's backstory, that is to say that because Naruto tells us a substantially different story than what Boruto tells us, it's kind of hard to wrap our heads around how powerful Kaguya was when she really did descend down to Earth. Like, yes, from Boruto, we know that she was able to rip Isshiki in half, which is crazy even if it is a surprise feat, because Naruto, even after expending the entirety of Kurama's life force to take on Baryon mode, was still barely able to inflict anything above superficial damage to Isshiki in their fight. Yet now, does this mean that Kaguya, because she was able to rip Isshiki in half, and a full-powered Isshiki, mind you, is stronger than Baryon mode Naruto? No, probably not. Like I said, it was a surprise feat. But it is worth noting that Kaguya was able to at least pull his body into two pieces. So while yes, for a little while there in the beginning of Kaguya's time on Earth, Isshiki probably was the strongest person, the first person to hold that title for any identifiable amount of time is Kaguya, who presumably after jumping Isshiki, tearing him in half, and feeding his legs to a Ten Tails, began to live the life that she told us about in Naruto. A life where she married into a clan of humans and began to live amongst them until eventually they turned against her. And after they turned against her, well, Kaguya only got stronger, as Kaguya consumed the chakra fruit that was presumably made with Ishiki's legs and enacted the first ever infinite Tsukiyomi. And an infinite Tsukiyomi that she very specifically didn't aim at all of humanity, because some people were going to have to survive this infinite Tsukiyomi to eventually populate the Earth down the line. And Kaguya herself was going to play a relatively major role in making sure that the future ninja world was populated because she had spent just enough time amongst humanity to get knocked up. And thus, while she was building her White Zetsu army to fight against an upcoming onslaught of Otsutsuki, she was also creating inside of her the life that would eventually take her title of strongest away from her. Because next up on our list in terms of people to hold on to the title of strongest Naruto character in the universe is Hagoromo. However, unfortunately for Hagoromo, even though he is the Sage of Six Paths, there isn't a singular moment while both Kaguya and Hagoromo are alive that Hagoromo was ever the strongest in the universe. See, because, well, yes, eventually Hagoromo was probably more than 50% of the reason that Kaguya was sealed the first time. It's not like Hagoromo killed Kaguya. Hagoromo worked in conjunction with his brother, who was also a son of Kaguya, Hamura, to use Six Paths Chibaku Tensei to seal Kaguya away. And I think you all know how I feel about Six Paths Chibaku Tensei, but if you don't, pulling off Six Paths Chibaku Tensei with somebody else to seal somebody like Kaguya does not make you stronger than Kaguya. The win condition to beating somebody being we both have to touch that person simultaneously with our palms does not make you stronger than the person you're fighting. That's as true for Hagoromo and Hamura as it is for Naruto and Sasuke at the end of the war arc. However, when Kaguya is sealed inside of the thing that eventually becomes the moon, and thus eliminating her from consideration of strongest possible person in the universe on account of the fact that she's just the core of a big rock right now, Hagoromo became the strongest person in the universe, something that was only made even more true when he took the chakra of the Ten Tails out of the Ten Tails and put it into himself, becoming in essence a Ten-Tailed Jinchuriki and ascending to his Sage of Six Paths level. Now, really the only argument here for somebody else who could possibly be considered as the strongest person in the universe would have been Hamura, but considering the fact that Hamura didn't get the chakra of the Ten Tails, even though he did eventually unlock the Tensei, leads me to believe that there was really never a moment in time where Hamura was even remotely as strong as Hagoromo. Though the fact that Hamura was the brother assigned to defend the Geto statue should tell you that he was very strong. But did he basically have limitless chakra? Or did he make the 5 treasure tools of the Sage of Six Paths? Did he create a staff that could make an infinite water source? And did he have creation of all things? Did he turn the chakra of the Ten Tails into the 9-tailed beasts? No, 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 and more no. And thus Hagoromo, basically from the moment that Kaguya was sealed up until his death, existed as the strongest person on Earth. He created ninju, which humanity was eventually able to combine with their physical energy to create chakra, which was molded into ninjutsu. And it was ninjutsu that his 2 sons used to battle to try and figure out amongst the 2 of them who was the strongest. See, because, well, yes, there's probably a couple of months in there, if not a couple of years, when Hagoromo was old and decrepit, one of, if not both of his sons were stronger than him, especially considering that it was before Hagoromo's death that he created the 9-tailed beast and therefore separated himself from the 10 tails chakra, but we really have no concrete way to pin down exactly when either Asura or Indra surpassed Hagoromo in strength outside of Hagoromo's death. But who amongst these 2 legendary brothers was stronger? Well, it's hard to say. I mean, there's a reason that their fight poured into dozens of other reincarnations that spanned 1,000 or so years. Asura and Indra were very equally matched. After all, Indra inherited the visual prowess of his father, while Asura inherited the chakra and life force. And for those of you who are saying, oh, well, Nick, Hagoromo chose Asura to be his rightful inheritor, it doesn't mean that Asura is stronger. What that means is that Asura more aligns with the moral standings of Hagoromo than Indra did. Asura was more willing to lead. He was friendlier. He led with a gentle hand. He was face to face with those he was in front of, a pattern that we see time and time again with all of the Asura and Indra reincarnations. Oh, but Nick, we saw in the anime Asura beat Indra in their final fight. It's filler. In the manga, we just see Hagoromo talking about how Asura and Indra's battle started while they were still alive and is still going on to this day. But in the anime, we see everybody kind of spirit bombing their chakra over to Asura so that he can prevail over his brother, which is interesting, I guess. I mean, it falls in line with the precedent. The Asura reincarnation is usually the one that comes out victorious over the Indra reincarnation, as both Hashirama and Naruto defeated their respective Indra reincarnations in Madara and Sasuke. But if we are just using canon materials, we don't really know who's stronger, Indra or Asura. However, if we take the filler content into perspective and consider the fact that Asura reincarnations have seemingly batted 1000% against Indra reincarnations, it's probably safe to assume that Asura is the stronger of the 2. And therefore, in a post-Kaguya and Hagoromo era, I believe that Asura is probably the strongest character in the universe. However, fortunately, after the era of Indra and Asura, things get a lot more concrete. Because really, the next era that we can talk about after Indra and Ashura is the end of the Warring States period, where Madara and Hashirama, the first reincarnations we know about, enter the fold. Now, fortunately for us, identifying who's stronger between Hashirama and Madara is a relatively simple task. Hashirama was able to lead the Senju to victory over the Uchiha to end the Warring States period, a feat that literally ended with him and his brother having swords to Madara's neck. And then after Hashirama, or I guess, well, technically Madara, decided to show pity on Hashirama because Madara was like, oh, you should unalive yourself, Hashirama. And he's like, oh yeah, okay, I'll do that. But anyways, after the two of them decided to kiss and make up, and spent a couple of years definitely not kissing behind closed doors, Madara abandoned the village, citing the fact that the Uchiha were being mistreated, and attacked Konoha multiple times. However, multiple times, Hashirama was able to repel him. And even when Madara rode in on the strongest of all of the tailed beasts under the control of his genjutsu, Hashirama was once again able to find victory, this time deciding to end Madara's life so that he could stop trying to destroy what the two of them spent so much time building. And thus in this era where both Hashirama and Madara existed simultaneously, Hashirama was always the stronger of the two. And that holds true until Hashirama's death. And unfortunately for Madara, I don't think he becomes the world's most powerful person even after Hashirama dies. See, Hashirama dies somewhere in the region of 60 or so years old, which means that when Hashirama dies, Madara's also probably somewhere in the region of 60 or so years old. And if Madara at the moment in time that Hashirama died, was truly the strongest person on Earth, wouldn't it stand to reason that he would use that overwhelming strength to take over Konoha like he had always wanted to? And thus Madara's lack of movement towards taking over Konoha, something that he had tried to do tons of times, to me implies that when Hashirama died, Tobirama took over the mantle as strongest person on Earth. Though admittedly, this is where things start to get a little bit contentious. Because, well, yes, Tobirama was able to cut down Izuna Uchiha, Madara's little brother, a Mangekyo Sharingan wielder, and yes, Tobirama created Edo Tensei, Flying Raijin, and the Shadow Clones. But fundamentally, Tobirama doesn't have a lot of wins under his belt, because immediately after becoming the second Hokage, Tobirama starts to run into a couple of issues. Most namely, Kinkaku and Genkaku, two descendants of Hagoromo and partial Jinchurikis of Kurama, who fought for the Hidden Cloud in the First Great Shinobi World War. Now, Kinkaku and Genkaku, outside of their legendary strength, were known for giving Tobirama fits. See, because when Tobirama went to the Hidden Cloud to try and discuss a peace treaty with the second Raikage, Kinkaku and Genkaku launched a surprise attack against him that almost killed him. And because of peace talks falling through, the First Great Shinobi World War was continued. And once again, when Tobirama found himself in the territory of the Hidden Cloud Village, this time doing recon, when he found out that his group's location had been found by Kinkaku, Genkaku, and 20 other shinobi, he decided to stay back and stall them so that his group of Shisui's grandfather, Hiruzen, Danzo, and Akamichi, and a couple others could make it back to Konoha. And it's in this ensuing battle that Tobirama dies. So was Tobirama truly the strongest person alive in a post-Hashirama era? Well, it's hard to say, because Kinkaku and Genkaku come as a package deal. But considering that we don't know what happens to Kinkaku and Genkaku after this fight, that is to say we don't know as to whether or not Tobirama kills them or not, the safest assumption to make here is that Tobirama is the strongest person left on Earth after Hashirama dies. But who is the strongest person left on Earth after Tobirama dies? Well, it's right about here where we need to start considering other Kage. However, unfortunately, the only other Kage that we have any real perception of their strength for are the Kage that are brought back during the Fourth Great Shinobi World War. The Gengetsus, the Mu's, the Third Raikages. However, considering the fact that Gengetsu and Mu killed each other, and that Gengetsu believes that when he was brought back with Edo Tensei that he was brought back by Tobirama, that tells us that Gengetsu, and therefore Mu, died before Tobirama. And thus the people in charge of the ninja world at the time of Tobirama's death were the third Mizukage, who we know nothing about, Anoki, who is still relatively young, probably the second Raikage, Hiruzen, and probably the second Kazekage, but that one's really hard to say. Which brings us to our real question. Who's more powerful between a Prime Hiruzen and a Prime Anoki? And if it could be real, I think the answer here is actually kind of obvious. It's Anoki. See, we do see some relatively impressive feats from Hiruzen. He's able to battle against Hashirama, Tobirama, and Orochimaru all simultaneously. However, the iterations of Hashirama and Tobirama brought brought back during Orochimaru and Hiruzen's battle are not the peak iterations of either of them. And yet still, Hiruzen is able to use Reaper Death Seal on both Hashirama, Tobirama, and Orochimaru's arms all at the same time. And even if we're not assuming that Hashirama or Tobirama had access to the entirety of their chakra, this means that even in his late 60s, early 70s, Hiruzen's chakra pool was still massive. However, unfortunately, outside of this fight against Orochimaru, Hiruzen doesn't have a lot of quantifiable feats. We know that he was able to push Kurama out of Konoha using his Monkey King Enma summoning staff, and that he's multiple times been involved in the formation of incredibly powerful barriers. But if we're talking about showing out while in non-peak form, Inoki's resume is way more impressive than Hiruzen's. Inoki not only would have vaporized Sasuke during the 5 Kage summit if Obito had not saved him, but he was also at least 50% responsible for stopping one of Madara's meteors at the beginning of the 4th Great Shinobi World War. And since we're talking about Inoki versus Madara, when Madara finds himself across from all 5 current Kage simultaneously, he identifies Inoki, who is in his late 70s or early 80s, I do not remember, as the only legitimate threat to him. Something that Inoki backs up multiple times, as not only does Inoki save all of the other Kage from a deep forest emergence by cutting it all away with a particle release, but also Inoki hits Madara twice with his particle release and destroys close to a dozen of Madara's Susanoo-clad clones. There's really no reason for us to assume that a prime Inoki wouldn't have been able to stand against this rendition of Madara, up until maybe he used his perfect Susanoo. However, I cannot say the same thing for a prime Hiruzen. Yes, Hiruzen is talked about as the god of shinobi in the beginning of Naruto, the strongest ninja alive. However, unfortunately, the feats just don't necessarily back that claim. And this era is unfortunately kind of muddy. This 2nd Great Shinobi World War era, that is. Because there are real legitimate claims to be made that at least 4 or 5 people were the strongest people in the world in this era. From Konoha, you had Sakamo Hatsuke, Hiruzen, the rise of the legendary Sannin. However, I would say that a prime Hiruzen is probably stronger than anybody else from Konoha, Sakamo Hatsuke included. I'm aware it was stated that he was stronger than all 3 of the legendary Sannin, but you know who was also stronger than all 3 of the legendary Sannin in this era? Hanzo the Salamander. And you know who was notorious for going head-to-head with Hanzo the Salamander? Well, Granny Chiyo, but also Mifune. And while it is canonically established that even though Mifune did go head-to-head with Hanzo the Salamander, Hanzo was stronger. But it's never stated who won in the numerous battles between Chiyo and Hanzo. But though considering how Hanzo is talked about, it's probably safe to assume in the trio of Chiyo, Hanzo, and Sakamo, Hanzo was the strongest. But does that make Hanzo the Salamander as strong as a prime Inoki or a prime Hiruzen? I'm going to say no. Now, does that mean that a prime Hiruzen could beat a late teens, early 20s version of Orochimaru, Tsunade, and Jiraiya simultaneously? Yeah, maybe actually. I mean, he literally trained them. And the same can probably be said for a prime Inoki. So for this muddy era that exists somewhere in the region towards the end of the 1st Great Shinobi World War and the 2nd Great Shinobi World War, I would say that the strongest people on Earth were either Hiruzen or Inoki. And arguments can be made for either of them depending on whether you want to look at the events of the 4th Great Shinobi World War or look at the claims made in early Naruto. However, from here on out, fortunately, there's substantially less conjecture. See, because as Hiruzen and Inoki got older, so did Jiraiya. And in the earliest renditions of the 3 legendary Sannin, and pretty much while all 3 of them were all alive simultaneously, Jiraiya was always the strongest. While yes, there's a legitimate counter argument to be made that Orochimaru was stronger than Jiraiya while both of them were alive, I think on account of the fact that Jiraiya's story is supposed to mirror Naruto's and Orochimaru is supposed to mirror Sasuke's, it's not crazy to assume that Jiraiya was probably stronger than Orochimaru, though the race was close. And thus, as Jiraiya hit his relative peak in power after the 2nd Great Shinobi World War, that is, say, when he was training with the Ame Orphans, and when he was in Konoha, being the Jonin leader to Team Jiraiya, or the earliest rendition of Team 7, or the Team 6. They were Team 6. I knew it was in there. Anyways, it's safe to relatively assume that Jiraiya's mid-20s to early 30s were probably the prime of his strength. However, unfortunately for the idea of Jiraiya holding on to the mantle of being the strongest person in the Naruto universe, he trained 2 people that would replace him. See, because while Jiraiya was probably the strongest person on Earth after the conclusion of the 2nd Great Shinobi World War, and maybe towards the beginning of the 3rd Great Shinobi World War, the 3rd Great Shinobi World War is when Minato was about 14 years old and Nagato was about 17 years old. And the 2 of them would emerge as the next candidates to be considered as the strongest people on Earth. And unfortunately, it kind of happens simultaneously for the both of them. See, because it's at the end of the Third Great Shinobi World War where Hanzo and Danzo team up together to betray the Akatsuki. A moment where Nagato accesses the outer path for the first time and summons the Ghetto statue. A moment that, while it fills his body with chakra rods and therefore basically makes him unable to move for the rest of his life, also kicks off the advent of the 6 Paths of Pain. However, it's also during the Third Great Shinobi World War that Minato begins to make his name for himself as the Yellow Flash of the Leaf, mastering his Rasengan, his Flying Raijin, and presumably his Toad Sage Mode. And it's at both of those moments that both of Jiraiya's students surpassed him in power. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that if Nagato and Minato met on the battlefield during the end of the Third Great Shinobi World War, Minato would come out victorious. It's not the craziest take of all time. The two of them are very close to each other in terms of power. I've been very vocal about the fact that I believe that Minato could defeat Itachi in a fight. And right above Itachi in terms of Akatsuki power scaling is Nagato. I mean, after all, Minato's Flying Raijin is basically the perfect counter to the Deva path. Oh no, you're pulling me in, I'll just jump to the mark I have behind me. Oh no, you're pushing me away, I'll just jump to the mark at your feet. And considering the fact that Naruto, with just Toad Sage Mode, and I guess a little help from Kurama, was able to defeat all 6 Paths of Pain, I'd reckon that Minato, with almost an identical kit plus Flying Raijin, stands a fairly decent chance. However, if you're a big Nagato fan and you want Nagato to be the strongest person on Earth, at least for a little bit, don't worry, Minato doesn't hold the title all that long, on account of die. And when Minato dies on the night of Naruto's birth, Nagato, not Obito, becomes the strongest person on Earth. Yes, I do believe that when everybody was in the Akatsuki together, Obito was stronger than Nagato. However, Yellow Mask Obito is probably losing to whatever iteration of Nagato that existed at that moment in time. Well, yes, I just said that 4th Hokage Minato would beat Nagato in a fight, and therefore saying that Obito was beaten by 4th Hokage Minato doesn't necessarily make him weaker than Nagato. I just don't think that Obito, who mind you at this moment in time is like 15 years old, has enough battle IQ or battle experience to defeat Nagato. Somebody who not only lived through the Second Great Shinobi World War, but was trained by Jiraiya and actively played a role in the Third Great Shinobi World War. And I'm aware that my timeline's a little wonky here. Minato becomes the 4th Hokage when the Third Great Shinobi World War comes to an end because Hiruzen steps down. But in order to continue the Third Great Shinobi World War, Danzo influences Hanzo to betray the Akatsuki. And Obito doesn't attack the village until after the conclusion of the Third Great Shinobi World War because Minato is already the Hokage. So to map it out to you, Minato holds on to the title of the strongest person in the universe when he surpasses Jiraiya in strength, presumably somewhere around the beginning of the Third Great Shinobi World War. When Nagato unlocks the outer path of the Rinnegan and creates the 6th Path of Pain at the end of the Third Great Shinobi World War, he becomes a legitimate contender against Minato. However, I would still reckon that 4th Hokage Minato is stronger than the earliest renditions of the 6 Paths of Pain. However, after Minato dies, after defeating Obito in his battle against Kurama, Nagato briefly snatches the crown and takes the title of strongest person in the universe. That is until a couple of years down the line, after Obito's given more time to perfect his Kamui abilities, and when Obito assumes the role of leader of the new iteration of the Akatsuki. It's at that moment that Obito becomes the strongest person on Earth. Stronger than, yes, Nagato. And Obito holds on to that title for like a long time. No one really ever challenges Obito in the holding of that title until Madara is brought back to life. Hiruzen is old, all of the other Kages aren't anything special. Jiraiya, who is the strongest of all 3 legendary Sannin, while all 3 of them were still alive, is defeated by Nagato, who's weaker than Obito, and Obito just keeps stacking strengths onto himself. Because, well, yes, Obito with just 1 Kamui Eye and another throwaway Sharingan was the strongest person in the universe. After Nagato gives his life to use Rinne Rebirth to bring everybody in Konoha back to life, and Obito is successful in the killing of Konan and the stealing of the Rinnegan, White Mask Obito emerges, who not only has a Kamui Eye, but also a Rinnegan, and therefore 6 Paths of Pain, who are all Jinchurikis with their tailed beasts sealed back into them. And my controversial opinion is that that guy, White Mask Obito, was maybe the strongest antagonist we ever saw in Naruto, though drastically underutilized. And honestly, even after Madara was brought back using Edo Tensei, there's a legitimate argument to be made who's stronger between the two of them. Is it Edo Tensei Madara, or is it still Obito? I mean, it's probably Madara, because like Obito at this moment in time, Madara had access not only to his Mangekyo Sharingan, but also his Rinnegan, but also he had infinitely refilling chakra and infinite regeneration, on account of the fact that he was an Edo Tensei body. And Madara was rather obviously only keeping Obito around because he wanted Obito's body to be able to use Rinne Rebirth on his soul. So Madara, the second that he's brought back by Kabuto, becomes the strongest person on Earth again. That is until, of course, Obito becomes Junior. Jubito, at which point in time he's stronger than Madara. And this idea of Madara not being the strongest person on Earth is only further compounded by the fact that Hashirama is then brought back to life by Orochimaru, and in a 1v1 between Hashirama and Madara, Hashirama once again wins. However, when all the tailed beasts are yanked out of Obito by Naruto, Sasuke, and the Shinobi Alliance, Ready Rebirth is used on Madara. He takes all of the tailed beasts under his control and he becomes Jubidara. And he holds on to the title of the strongest character in the Naruto universe until his death. Yes, it doesn't matter how much power you give Naruto or Sasuke Hagoromo, neither of them individually measured up to Madara. It's kind of like how we were talking about Kinkaku and Ginkaku's battles against Tobirama. Well, yes, the combined forces of Naruto and Sasuke working together was enough to overwhelm even the strongest iterations of Madara. Individually, neither of them ever could have pulled that off. However, in the moment that Madara dies and his body is used as a vessel to bring Kaguya, the first entry on this list, back to life, he stops, very obviously, being the strongest person in the universe, and that title is given back to our first entry, Kaguya. And she holds on to this title until, like Madara, she's killed by a 6-pass Chibaku Tensai. Because, once again, even though the combined forces of Sakura, Naruto, Sasuke, and a DMS Kakashi were able to bang with the likes of Kaguya, individually none of them would have been strong enough. Ties into the fact that, like with the first time that she was defeated, the win state to win against her was just Naruto and Sasuke touching her simultaneously, and it becomes entirely too clear that neither Naruto nor Sasuke were even close to Kaguya's level of strength. However, after Kaguya is sealed in a moon in her own dimension that apparently kills her according to the data books, Naruto gets to rule over the world as the strongest person, cemented by the fact that immediately after Kaguya is defeated, the only possible person who could argue Naruto for title of the strongest fights against Naruto and loses in Sasuke. And after the defeat of Sasuke, Naruto gets to hold on to the title of strongest for a couple of years. That is until the last, when Toneri, the only surviving member of Hamura's clan on the moon, abducts Hinata and steals Hanabi's eyes and awakens in himself a Tenseigan. A Tenseigan that gives him access to a crazy powerful form that's able to go toe-to-toe with maybe the strongest ever iteration of Naruto we've seen, outside of Baryon mode, obviously, but ultimately falls flat, as Naruto's able to tank everything that Toneri throws at him, and eventually Naruto and Hinata are able to use Hagoromo and Hamura's chakra respectively to destroy the Tenseigan. And thus Naruto, for a dozen or so more years, holds on to this title of strongest in the universe. That is, until his son takes his Chunin exams. Because it's during the Boruto Chunin exams arc, or as it's known, the versus Momoshiki arc, that Momoshiki is introduced. And listen, Momoshiki is not immediately stronger than Naruto. Sasuke, without using any rendition of his Susanoo whatsoever, was able to bang with Kinshiki and Momoshiki simultaneously, and only left because battling against the two of them in their dimension would be troublesome. And therefore, if a non-fused Momoshiki, and just a non-fused Momoshiki, fought one-on-one against Naruto, I think Naruto actually stands a fair to decent chance at taking a victory. And this is evidenced by the fact that Momoshiki is completely overwhelmed by the combined force of Sasuke and Naruto. So much so that he has to beg Kinshiki to fuse with him so he can reach a level of power that can fight against these two at the same time. And honestly, even after Momoshiki fuses with Kinshiki, Naruto and Sasuke are still too much for him. Without the meddling from the guy who made the Shinobi Gauntlet throwing a bunch of jutsus at Momoshiki that he used to reamp his power, Naruto and Sasuke were putting a whoop on fused Momoshiki, so much so that he should have died without Boruto stepping into the story at all. But because Boruto needed to step into the story on account of the fact that it's, his story, there had to be something that revitalized the fight in Momoshiki. Now, does this mean that a fused Momoshiki is weaker than adult Naruto? I can't say that. Fused Momoshiki is probably stronger than adult Naruto, but we can't say for certain. But if anybody was gonna steal that crown from Naruto, even for just a couple of minutes, it was fused Momoshiki. But on account of the fact that fused Momoshiki exists for like 10 minutes before he's killed, to me means that Naruto, even after the introduction of Momoshiki, holds on to the title of the strongest. But did that title ever even belong to Naruto in the first place? In fact, did any of these titles ever belong to any of the people we've listed up until this point? Because after Momoshiki is eliminated and Kara is introduced as the new Gen Akatsuki, at the head of Kara, Jigen as a character is introduced. Jigen, the Kara vessel for Isshiki, Kaguya's superior, somebody who's been around since Kaguya descended down to Earth. And Jigen makes it immediately clear in his first ever fight, after absorbing some chakra from the Ten Tails, that not only is he stronger than Naruto, but that he's stronger than Naruto and Sasuke simultaneously. And therefore, if Jigen, who's been around since Kaguya descended to the Earth, is stronger than adult Naruto and adult Sasuke simultaneously, wouldn't it stand to reason that Jigen was stronger than every person on this list? Yeah, well, unfortunately, yeah, 100% actually. However, consider the fact that we don't have a concrete answer for why Jigen didn't try to take over the world earlier, it's probably safe to assume that Jigen didn't hit this level of power until he found a suitable Kara vessel in Kawaki, and therefore for that reason and kind of just that reason alone, we get to have all the other names on this list. But also, who's to say? The most logical explanation that we have is that Jigen couldn't go all out in combat against the high-level threats in the Naruto universe until he had a suitable vessel. Because even after his relatively quick battle against Naruto and Sasuke, Jigen as a vessel begins to break. But still, upon Jigen's introduction, he is immediately set up as the strongest person in the universe. And honestly, considering the fact that he could have done this whenever he wanted to, but didn't just because he needed a backup body to go into after he did it, Jigen is probably the strongest person throughout all of Naruto's history, and all of the names we've mentioned are irrelevant. But still, Jigen rather forcefully yanks the crown off Naruto's head, in a rare moment that doesn't require somebody dying for that crown to be passed. And Jigen and Isshiki hold on to this crown until Isshiki dies. And no, Baryon Mode Naruto is not stronger than Isshiki. He overwhelmed him in terms of speed, but in terms of AP, Baryon Mode Naruto barely scratches Isshiki's durability. But hey, at least when Isshiki dies, Naruto probably gets the title of strongest in the universe again. Right? No, unfortunately. And that's not just because Naruto loses Kurama after his battle against Isshiki. That's not it. It's because after the battle against Isshiki, Daemon gets introduced as a character. And as much as some of you are gonna hate this, based on what Boruto has told us, Daemon might be stronger than adult Naruto. I mean, Daemon was specifically kept in cryo holding because he was stronger than Jigen, and Jigen is stronger than adult Naruto. But hey, at least Daemon's title has been taken from him by Jiraiya. Maybe. Jiraiya should be stronger than Daemon. But, so hey, at least the entity that's now stronger than adult Naruto ever was is a tree and not a child. That's an upgrade, right? But then again, maybe it's not. What do you think? Tell me in the comments below. And while you're down there, tell me who you believe held on to the title of strongest in the universe for the longest. Did I miss anybody? And also, while you're down there, like the video, hit the noti bell, and I'm forgetting how to do it. I've been out of water for like 45 minutes and the voice is starting to go. I gotta run.